Welcome back to Second Breakfast and our ongoing coverage of A Game of Thrones, bringing you the best thoughts, theories, and literary analysis this side of the Eastern and Western markets.
There you go. I was wondering what you were going to choose this time.
Usually I prep it. I could have said Dothraki Sea, but I literally remembered I hadn't prepped it while I was talking.
I could see the panic in your eyes. It was really fun to watch.
Yeah. So today we've joined to talk about Daenerys Chapter 6.
I'm very excited.
Interesting. This is our 6th Targaryen checkpoint. If you haven't been here before, go listen to the other 50-odd episodes of this series.
This would be a weird place to start, just like smack dab in the middle of the book. But sure, welcome if you're new.
We have this working theory that the Dany chapters of A Song of Ice and Fire act as these thematic and tonal checkpoints that sort of reflect what has come before and preview what is to come in the next bunch of chapters before the next Dany chapter.
Yeah, it's been a fun thread to follow, and that's really what I leaned into here, and I feel like you probably did too.
But before we get into all of our thoughts, theories, and literary analysis, what happened in this chapter, Maggie? Spoilers for everything in the books and the show.
Let me tell you. So Dany is with Drogo, her husband, and he is telling her that he does not want to cross the narrow sea to go to Westeros. He has no interest in a metal chair, or iron chair, I think is what he calls it, meaning the Iron Throne. And because in his head, she's like, well, the stallion who will mount the world, like he needs to go to the edge of the world. And he's like, yeah, that's the sea. Like, that's right over here. Like, that's the edge of the world. The Dothraki have this strong superstition and fear of the ocean. They call it the poison water because the horses can't drink salt water, so therefore it's dangerous. And I don't think they've heard of boats. Anyway, so she's kind of frustrated by that. And he goes off to hunt. And so Dany talks to Jorah and says, hey, can you reason with Drogo? Like, we really got to cross this sea so I can go, claim my throne. And Jorah says, you got to be patient with the Dothraki. They do things in their own time. Don't make the same mistake that your brother did. And Drogo's off hunting. And so for that day, the Western market is open. And Dany loves going to the market, as do I. We love a little market peruse, going to the different stalls. So she decides to go do that.
A farmer's market.
Listen, me and Dany, as white women, we love the farmer's market, okay?
She's going to go antiquing with Jeekwe.
Yeah, exactly. So she's, having a good time wandering around. And she comes up to a wine stall. And this guy basically tries to sell her a bottle of poison wine. Jorah puts a stop to it. They capture the guy. And it's very dramatic and very exciting. The reason Jorah was so suspicious is because he had just gotten a letter from Illyrio, which said that King Robert had is offering a lordship to anyone who kills Viserys, Dany, or Dany's unborn child. Of course, King Robert doesn't know that Viserys is already dead, but this is like put Jorah on high alert. So Dany's like, okay, got it. And so they get back to, where they're staying. And Dany is like determined not to let this get to her, not to be afraid. She's like, I am the dragon. I have to protect my son and myself. And she kind of has this moment alone where she's not really sure why, but she feels compelled to like start a fire in the brazier.
Her spidey senses are tingling.
Even though it's like 1,000 degrees outside. She does this and she puts her dragon eggs on the fire. She doesn't really know why. She knows it's probably a stupid idea, but she does it. But then nothing happens. A little while later, Drogo gets back from his hunt and Dany tells him what happened at the market. And Drogo is sort of emboldened by this and says, okay, we're going to cross the sea and we're going to take the Iron Throne. And it's very, very exciting. And that's where we leave it.
Yeah, just to flesh it out a little bit more, because I'm going to talk about it later. The thing with the poison wine, she's in the Western market, which is more goods and things from Westeros that remind
from the West.
her of home.
Yeah.
The smell, the all of these kind of sensory experiences bring her back to the home she never knew.
Compared to the Eastern market, because she's kind of they're kind of in the middle of the map.
Yeah.
And so the stuff to the east is where the Eastern market would be, but this is, of course, in the West.
And she starts talking to this wine seller, and he notices the language she's speaking in and the accent, and then she identifies herself, and then he brings out this wine from the back.
Yes.
That is the poison.
Yes.
Just to flesh that out
Yeah,
bit.
Thank you.
Thank you for that recap. That was excellent. So I want to start kind of as zoomed out as possible here, talking about this as our 6th Targaryen checkpoint. I have 3 things that I want to play with, if you give me a little runway.
Okay, you got it.
My big takeaway from this chapter was a narrowing of scope and an increasing allegorical negotiation of the sigils that we're playing with. So to take them individually, the scope, this is very brief. The scope, this is the most standalone or remote storyline that we have in the book. And in this chapter, we pivot back towards Westeros. And we make a declaration that we're going to, storm the gates of King's Landing.
Right.
So we're pivoting back to center. There's this thing about series and franchises where they can expand the world for the first, 2/3, and then you really have to start narrowing it and bringing everything in together.
That makes sense.
Obviously, we know she isn't going to King's Landing soon, but I think it's an interesting sort of message to send the reader as the book starts to pivot into that final third.
That's the intention. And I guess, as a first-time reader, you probably do think, the way the story is going, oh, she's going to get to Westeros by the end of the book, and, that's going to be the grand finale. Of course, it's not. And he loves, a pivot. But, that's a really good point.
And then the sigils, this is interesting. There's another kind of narrowing effect like we just talked about, because the imagery, the label, this almost nickname of the dragon, now that Viserys is dead and gone, that label is being solely applied to Dany.
Yeah.
And in this chapter, now that she's the sole beneficiary of this tag, she starts to lean into it more. And I think if you zoom out again and look at kind of the movements of this chapter, Dany's starting to act more like a dragon. In this chapter, she's warming her eggs.
True.
And metaphorically, she's breathing fire against her enemies. And if you look at the way she feels about King's Landing, she's kind of coveting a castle full of riches.
Okay, sure, yeah.
She's doing all these kind of dragon-y activities.
She even says to Drogo when they're going to go across the sea, she's like, we're going to fly across the sea. Because she's trying to explain to Drogo what a boat is and saying it's this thing that has all these, it's like a horse with many legs and wings that catch on the wind. So we're going to fly across the sea.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Yes, I love that. And I was trying to zoom out into this because you've got the scope and you've got the sigils, but those are more mechanics of the writing and the plot. And there was something else. There was kind of a melancholy that I was getting. There was such a tonal quality to this chapter. So I wanted to take a second and talk about the tone because I think it ties really strongly back into those other two elements. The feeling I was getting was of Dany's homesickness. For this home she's never known. It's that much more complicated. It's not just missing the place you grew up. It's missing the place you should have grown up that was stolen from you.
Yeah, she does a lot of thinking about, what is my home? I don't really know what home is. I have, the house with the red door when I was a kid. I have Westeros, which I've never been to. She's really struggling with, I think we talked about this before in other chapters, struggling with figuring out what home is to her and what she really longs for and where she's meant to be.
Yes, and in real time, it's not just about her feeling homesick. It's about that feeling being a cautionary tale. Because it's the nostalgic wine that reminds you of home that is poisoned. The nostalgia is poison. And I think that immediately recalls one of the aphorisms we've been kind of batting around for the last few weeks. The things we love destroy us every time.
Oh, that's great.
Because this guy jangles the keys of things that remind her of home, and that's a smoke screen where he's trying to slip the poison under while she's distracted.
Right, when she's really leaning into I remember I loved going to the markets when I was a kid. She's leaning into that nostalgia. Her guard is let down, and that's where she's in danger.
It's so much more than that, too, because like we said, there's so much talk of homes you've never been to. There's so much discussion in this chapter of language, of mother tongues, of languages that you were raised with that you never get to use anymore because no one else literally or figuratively speaks your language. And then right after that, we kind of slip in that betrayal when she does get to speak the common tongue, and that's the guy who tries to kill her. This homesick feeling is deadly. It's letting down your guard. Like you were saying, it's a mirage. And that pivots us back to our other aphorism from last week where we talked about Bran chapter 6, no one ever comes back. I thought that was an interesting kind of development again, because she can never go back home. She can never go back to, it's not even home, right? She's not going back anywhere because she's never been to King's Landing.
Yeah.
But this whole victorious march on King's Landing is being viewed as a homecoming.
Yeah, that's true. And we know that even when she does finally get there, it's not the way it used to be. She's not coming back to, what Westeros was like when her father was in charge.
And she's not the same person. She's not a Targaryen like they used to be. She's not, the small folk are whispering and raising secret toasts to you.
Nothing like that.
There's none of that. She's this terrifying fire-breathing conqueror who roasts most of the people in King's Landing. So I finally feel like I understand that no one ever comes back more. it's not just about the scattering of the Stark clan.
Yeah.
I think it goes much deeper now.
That's really interesting. Yeah, this idea of being forever changed and constantly changing. We talked a lot about how the identities of our Stark children change many times over the course of their stories and just in the course of this book so far. Same thing's going to happen with Dany. She's a Khaleesi. She's a breaker of chains. She's all these things as she goes through her arc.
With the kids, it's a lot about them changing because their locations haven't changed that much. But I think with Dany, since she has moved around so much through this world, the closer allegory might be to the Stark parents, because they're much older, because they've lived multiple lives, they've lived in multiple parts, multiple realms of this world. That whole aphorism of no one ever comes back. Look at what happens when Ned goes back to King's Landing after conquering it. Look how it's not the place he left, and he's not the person who left it.
True.
Same thing with Catelyn going back to the Vale or the Eyrie to see her sister, to rouse these bannermen. None of it is like she left it. So I think we're hitting that theme again and again, and it's increasingly bitter. We've got these homecomings teased, but they're dangerous and incomplete. And I know we only have so many chapters left in this book, but I think that's something we should look for as we move forward. And going back to the original two ideas of scope and sigils, I think there's an immediate resonance across our other POVs with these two ideas too. As we've gone through the last chunk of the story from the last Targaryen checkpoint, we've seen every POV character get more direction. Arya's on the run, and she's this amateur swordsman. Sansa is this kind of politically aspirational lady in captivity. Everyone's kind of got their story now. We don't know where it's going to go, but they're kind of on the train tracks.
Yeah, like it feels like pre this checkpoint, this section, we were waiting for the shoe to drop. We were waiting for stuff to happen. Now things have happened, and so we have a clearer direction.
Jon is settled in the Night's Watch, and he's fought a White Walker. Like everyone kind of has their task now. Their journey has started here.
Sure.
But as far as their sigils go, I think we're almost getting more literal and less metaphorical. Like the scattering and breaking of the Stark Fellowship has put them all off on their own paths, to the point that we saw Rickon wandering alone in the crypt in the last chapter. Like, even though he and Bran are still in the same general location, they're on their own paths now.
Definitely. And Robb just left as well. So,
yes. Yeah. They're all broken up. So instead of having this big Stark Fellowship that we started with at the beginning of the book, now they're all lone wolves. And if we look forward, I think as everyone spreads out further and we get to know more of this world, we know Arya's going to go far and wide until she's, learning to be no one, and she's got friends who don't have faces, and she's got that whole plot line that she's about to go off. I think everyone's going to get even more atomized.
Yeah.
But being lone wolves, they're also formidable.
Yes.
There's more, we're going to see their teeth more, too. And if we look at our only other non-Stark POV character, it's Tyrion. I flipped back through my entire notebook here that has everything we've done so far. It's Dany, it's all the Starks, and it's Tyrion. He's the only other POV character.
Yeah, we haven't seen him in a long time.
We haven't.
I'm realizing now.
Right, but every time we do, there's massive growth there.
Yeah.
But if we talk about this kind of negotiation of the sigils as these metaphors, as these aspirations, Dany's always talking about wanting to live up to be the dragon.
Yes.
Tyrion, I mean, we kind of have the benefit of hindsight here, having read the books and seen the show, but we know he is growing into a lion in real time here.
Yes.
As Ned is on his way out, Tyrion's on his way in.
I see.
We know that he will start the second book and season as Hand of the King. So if we have, 2 chapters left of Tyrion in this book, those are both going to be monster promotions.
True.
So I don't know. I'm finding more from these sigils. At the beginning, it was just like an easy way to understand all of these factions and alliances, but I'm finding more depth in the imagery now.
Yeah, and they're all coming into their sigils. And some of them are really choosing that, like Dany, and some of them are not choosing it at all, like Ned or Arya. It's like by necessity. But that is really interesting. I hadn't really thought about it like that before, and I really like that. I'm really excited about what you had said about nostalgia and about like the poison of nostalgia, because one thing I was grappling with here was this thread that's been going for the past few chapters about childhood, and I think that is sort of wrapped up and culminated here.
Ooh, okay.
But I didn't have like a fully final understanding of it, but I think this nostalgia thing that you're leaning on is helping me understand that. Let me kind of break it down, because, the last few chapters we talked about how these different Stark children, particularly Arya and Jon and Bran, but Sansa in a way too, are leaning into their childhood selves and their childlike tendencies and perspectives. And that is helping them in, to varying degrees. But that's sort of like where a lot of them are finding their strength, in addition to all of these, unfortunate adult tendencies they have to lean into as well in order to survive. But, we see that here with Dany too, especially when it comes to the market and this nostalgia like you were talking about. But it's not just nostalgia, it's nostalgia from her childhood specifically. And there's like a childlike quality to a lot of the things she's experiencing in this chapter. We see her, going through the markets and like remembering being a kid. It says that the Eastern market was a place of wonder and magic for Dany, but the Western market smelled of home. So when you think of wonder and magic, I mean, those two words together, it just looks like Disneyland to you. And that's such a childlike way to think about something like a market. And even it saying it smelled of home, that's like reminding her of this nostalgia like you're talking about. But she also says, when I was a little girl, I loved to play in the bazaar. When she's having a moment where she's laughing, and it says it was sweet to laugh. She felt half a girl again. And she buys some perfumes of her childhood. And so she's really, wanting to lean into that. But like I said earlier, when she really leans into that nostalgia and that childlike element of herself, that's when her guard is down and she becomes vulnerable. And that's, if it weren't for Jorah, she probably would not have, she would have taken that wine and drank it and died. Right. And so what is interesting about her is she has to find a balance between her childhood and her adulthood in a much stronger way than I think any of the other Stark children have had to so far. I mean, we've said before, all of these kids have to grow up fast and are dealing with really adult things, but Dany is kind of separate.
She's on a whole other level.
Yes. Yeah. And because she's having to just balance it a lot more. And I feel like here she reminded me most of Sansa because, but it's like Sansa, but in an extreme, because one thing that Dany does, apart from just like having to grow up fast, is that she does a lot of forcing everything to be the way that it needs to be. The way we talked about that with Sansa last time, right? She says like, you must do this. Things have to happen this way. You're messing it up. You're spoiling it. It has to be a certain way. And Dany does that here too. It says she would not weep. She decided. She would not shiver with fear. The usurper had woken the dragon now. She told herself. So she's kind of forcing herself into this dragon role, like by sheer force of will, the way that Sansa does that too. And interestingly enough, Dany and Sansa are both motivated by similar things. They're motivated by stories that are imbued with magic. For Sansa, it's songs and poetry and, tales. For Dany, it's prophecy. It's the stallion who will mount the world prophecy. That's been her big motivation the past few Dany chapters. And interestingly, both songs and prophecy feel kind of childlike, especially songs, but prophecy too. Like, we've seen different levels of skepticism in this world of who believes in prophecy and who doesn't. But a lot of people are like, yeah, but that's just, the way that people talk about, yeah, but giants don't exist anymore. Oh, dragons have been dead for 1,000 years. Like, nobody actually believes in prophecy, or a lot of people don't. But she's really adamant about that. The way that Sansa is adamant about modeling her life after a song. And so they kind of have that in common. And so it's like, that's the childhood element that they need to lean into versus the nostalgia like you're talking about. This is where it's starting to make sense for me. Leaning to the nostalgia, the memories, it's a nice thing, but it means you lay your guard down and you have to sort of, by sheer force of will, make yourself strong and grown up, but still leaning into and being motivated by this childlike resource. this source of inspiration is a little bit more childlike, or some might even call it like naive to, believe in it the way that Sansa does. And so this prophecy is what's happening here too. Because what's interesting is that I'm trying to figure out like what makes Dany decide to put the eggs in the fire.
Okay.
It's not totally clear. Like we see that, like, I don't know if this is what causes it, but at least precedes it. When she has that moment saying like, no, the usurper has awoken the dragon. Like, I am the dragon now. I have to stay strong. I have to, I can't be afraid. I have to protect my son. It's right after that she has the moment where she's like, I got to put these eggs in the fire. And I don't know if it's like her willpower that awakens that magic, or if it's more complicated and less direct than that. But it's interesting that that's what immediately precedes that moment where it kind of overtakes her. And there's almost a supernatural force that's causing her to do it. Because it says like, She didn't know why she was doing it. She just kind of felt like she had to. She thought this is probably crazy. Like, this is madness. Why am I doing this? But I feel like I have to. So it feels like she's being almost overtaken by some kind of magical force. I'm curious what you thought about that.
I think it's a bit of a cross-pollination thing. We talk about this a lot in terms of the show, especially once we get into the later seasons, and spoiler, her child doesn't survive at the end of this book. We start to talk about the dragons as her children. And even she starts to say, like, these are the only children I'll ever have.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that when she's trying to engage this really strong, protective, maternal instinct, she then warms the dragon eggs, who will be her kind of other children.
Oh, that's interesting.
So
yeah.
it's almost like some instinct or whatever kind of dragon impulse is within her is firing to protect the other. I guess they're all boys, right? The dragons.
They're all boys.
So her other sons.
Yeah, it's less.
Like if you're sending the signal to your brain, protect your son, and then she starts warming her other sons, you know?
Yeah, so it's less about her and more about her as a mother. It's you could call that maternal instinct.
And a dragon.
Which like is in our real world. That maternal instinct for many people feels very like magical and supernatural, and it's like not something you really experience until you have a child, and then it like really changes you. And that's really interesting.
To tie this back to what you were talking about last time with folklore and how dismissed a lot of these legends are, they all came from Old Nan, who has that kind of permanent maternal presence in Winterfell. It's interesting that as Dany grows into this maternal role, and she keeps talking about, well, I'm going to be a mother to my son, and then when I grow up, I'm going to be part of the Dosh Colleen with all these other old women who are permanently in this child-rearing maternal role. How different are the Dosh Colleen from Old Nan?
That's great.
And these are the only characters in the story who take the supernatural, who take the folkloric seriously.
That's really great. I love that connection. I think that works really well. Yeah, so this was like, it's interesting because I think lately we've been talking about the Targaryen checkpoint as sort of the introduction or the beginning of the next section of the book, but this feels like a wrapping up of the last one. Now, it might be that over the next, 5 or 6 chapters, however many are before the next Dany one, we might recognize things that are in this chapter that we don't, yet understand as trends. So maybe it's acting as both. So it's almost like this sandwiching effect. But it's interesting that it's like kind of wrapping all this up, and Dany is sort of, I'm really curious about linking her with Sansa, and both of them having this like really strong force of will and being motivated by these stories and songs. But I guess so is Bran, and so is Jon, and so is Arya.
But connecting any of the Starks to a non-Stark is a pretty rare thing. How often have we talked about echoes between any of the Stark POVs and Tyrion?
Yeah.
You making this kind of first strong connection between a Stark POV and Dany, I think that's an interesting moment.
Right, because the only connections we really made are like Jon and Dany, but that makes sense. We talked about that a lot. It's Jon being the Targaryen and them.
And again, that's sort of benefit of hindsight.
Yeah, but I honestly didn't see a lot of Jon correlations here other than this continuation of stories in childhood.
But maybe that's the thing that we should take from this checkpoint is this new idea of cross-pollination, where it's not just looking to the future, but there is this striking new retrospective quality to this 6th Targaryen checkpoint.
Yeah, which is really interesting with your sigil stuff. If they're all leaning into their sigils and sort of like, I don't know, becoming more and more distinct, it's interesting that there's like an increase in cross-pollination and overlap as well. That's really fun.
And we talk about Dany now being the only dragon, being literally the only Targaryen left in the world. I mean, she doesn't know about the guy at the wall, but whatever.
Or Jon.
Yeah, sure. But for all intents and purposes, right now, she's the only one pursuing the throne.
Yes.
But if she's the lone dragon, I just made the point about all the Starks currently being lone wolves. So yeah, we are starting to get these moments of cross-pollination across our POVs.
And weirdly enough, the thing that Drogo is hunting in this chapter is a lion. It's a white lion. It's not a golden lion.
Very nice.
I don't know. I thought that was fun.
Sure. Yeah. So scope, sigils, and tone. Those were kind of my bellwethers for this chapter. But I wanna piggyback off of this cross-pollination idea because I another one of those feelings I'm trying to investigate. I was looking at my little outline that I do on the top of my notes, and I have a bullet point here for the East and West markets, the Eastern and Western markets that Dany looks at. One of them is this place of wonder and magic and all these new cultural experiences and sensory experiences, such a sensory chapter. And then the Western market has this sort of nostalgia that she's quietly trying to catch up on of all these things that smell like home, but it's not her home. It's the home you know what I mean?
Yeah, her
it's
idea of home. Yeah. Yeah, and that's like her, like one of her main problems is she has this idea of what home is and what her reign is going to be and how she's going to be received by Westeros, and it's very different from what she thinks it's going to be.
But I love the difference. I mean, I was thinking of Great Gatsby for a second, of East Egg and West Egg, and how these Eastern and Western markets, we see them through Dany's eyes as being incredibly different, because we are inside her head and we are so biased along with her personal experience. But if you zoom out past that, kind of beyond just Daenerys Targaryen, how different are the Eastern markets and the Western markets? Because they all kind of follow the same rules. There's the same level of politicking and sales and kind of flattering people and explaining your goods and the group dynamics of everyone walking through the markets, the trading with the same currencies. There is something similar about all of this, and I think that kind of cross-pollination happens under the surface constantly in this chapter. Just the fact of Robert's hit that he put out on Dany, the fact that reaches her, that we see kind of the full arc of the letter being received, we follow the little postman across the world, that shrinks this world for me.
Yeah,
To see kind of the call and response of, in King's Landing, we see Robert put out the hit, and now we see that received and acted upon. For me, that shrinks the world, that ties this world together, and demystifies a lot of the exterior cultural differences that are so wondrous and dazzling to Dany. She talks about the black and white striped horses and the zebras and all of these things that are on their surface. The visuals of this chapter, if you had a true adaptation of this book in a way that would never work on TV, where you had every single chapter as like its own episode.
Yeah, right.
This would be such an aesthetically varied chapter.
Yes, absolutely. It'd be so vibrant and diverse and colorful.
To the point that it feels like George is trying to exaggerate the differences between different cultures and peoples, and having characters wonder at the variety and diversity of those aesthetics.
Yeah.
But again, underneath the surface, a guy's offering lands and a title to kill someone, so everyone jumps at it.
Sure.
Like the instincts are the same. People are acting on this the same. We know that Jorah is about to, eventually he'll be revealed for this treason, right? Of him kind of being in communication with King's Landing. And that is not a unique betrayal. Every single person we just saw in King's Landing with Littlefinger. He's a turncoat too. We just saw with Jon at the Wall. Half the guys filling the ranks at the Night's Watch are liars or turncoats.
Right.
These similarities keep bubbling up. And with a chapter that hits difference so hard, with the spices, with the zebras, the scents, the aesthetics, the sensory qualities, underneath all of that, once we get to the interpersonal mechanics of the chapter, all of these different groups of people felt hugely familiar. I thought there was this wonderful unifying quality in this chapter. For example, the wine cellar attempts to play to Dany's ego.
Yeah.
Once he learns she's a princess, he does all the bending and scraping. But in the same way, earlier in the chapter, when Dany's talking about, oh God, I have to explain boats to this guy again so we can get back to King's Landing, she says when Drogo gets back from the hunt, he'll be in a better mood and I can talk to him then. So she's trying to play to his ego too.
Interesting.
And I think this cross-pollination thing is embodied yet again right in the very beginning of the chapter, before you're looking for these clues. The ease of this multilingual communication. Remember, this is the 6th Dany chapter. When they met in the, second or third chapter, they couldn't talk to each other at all.
Right.
And now they're having an argument. They're having a full, it's a little clumsy, but they're having a full conversation.
Yeah.
So we're seeing them able to communicate with each other. I saw these kind of invisible bridges and cross-pollination everywhere in this chapter. Did you get any of this?
I wasn't thinking about it, but now that you're saying it, it makes total sense, especially because Dany, more than anybody else, wants to be this uniting force. Her son is the stallion who will mount the world. He'll unite all of everybody into a single Khalasar, right? Bringing everybody together from all corners of the world in a way that nobody else wants to or is trying to do in this story. We have people vying for the throne of Westeros, but nobody gives a shit what's happening across the Narrow Sea. Nobody cares what's happening beyond the wall. Or if they do care what's happening beyond the wall, they're not thinking about the free cities. They're not thinking about, Pentos and stuff. And so that makes sense for this to be this moment, especially it's a key critical moment where Dany decides, I am the final like I am the last dragon. My son is going to conquer the world and unite everybody. And my husband, you know, who I need to do this, is united with me. That makes a lot of sense for this all to be happening in this chapter. So I think that's a really great analysis. Because I was thinking, what purpose did the market serve other than it's a cool, you know, deep dive into the different cultures of Westeros, and it is part of like Dany's nostalgia, childhood, adulthood journey. But this makes a lot of sense.
I think we're paying off a lot of the ideas that we've been noticing, a lot of the tools that George has been using in telling the story. We spent a year talking about different types of echoes and distillations, but I think we're making that matter more now when we're seeing the scope narrow and tighten. We're seeing cross-pollination. We're seeing these people on similar journeys. We're getting a connective tissue between them, whether they're learning to speak the same language, whether we're seeing people of different families and allegiances on similar paths. I think it's starting to mean something rather than just being an interesting plot mechanic to break down.
Yeah, and speaking of echoes, I actually did find one small echo I wasn't sure where to fit it in, but it'll work nicely here. There's some nice mirroring between two different kings. You made connections between King Viserys and King Robert before and others, but I think we've got a great connection between Drogo and Robert. Because I said earlier, you know, Drogo was going off to fight this, or to hunt this white lion. What was one of the last things King Robert did? He went to go to hunt a white hart. So it's a white hart versus a white lion. I was like, okay, this lion could have been any color, and George made it white. Like that. I mean, other than like an albino, you know, big cat is a really like interesting, rare thing. And we even today value white tigers, right? In a way that's actually really dangerous and harmful.
I saw some white tigers.
They're pretty cool.
At the Dallas Aquarium.
They are inbred as fuck. But anyway, you didn't ask. But so that connection was interesting. And interestingly, Drogo returns unharmed, which is not what happens to King Robert. Drogo succeeds. He gets the white lion. Robert does not. He fails to kill it. Somebody else has to kill it for him. And he's all pissed about it. Actually, I don't even know if they do kill it in the first place, but it doesn't work and he's pissed, and that's what makes him go fight the boar. Then that's what kills him. So that's interesting. But so that's a diversion, but then it comes back because I noticed also in this chapter, none of them yet know that King Robert has died. It's possible that this chapter is taking place in the timeline before Robert is dead, but he died 5 chapters ago. So presumably we're in time with these chapters and with the chronology. So King Robert is dead, but nobody yet knows. And in the same way, none of them yet know that Drogo is soon going to be dead too. Dead for different reasons, but also dying of a wound and, bleeding out and getting infected and dying. And so I thought that crossover was really interesting. And the other one connection between the two is both of these kings plan to attack or dominate or kill children. And for both of them, the results are not going to work. King Robert has this hit out on Dany and her unborn child, who Dany's also a child, and that was Ned's big criticism. And Drogo in this chapter claims they're going to get to Westeros and he's going to take their children and have them be slaves and all this stuff. So they're both planning to cause harm to children, and for both of them it doesn't end so well.
It's kind of a fractured echo jumping off that, because in King's Landing you have one king, so he goes and tries to fight the White Hart and he dies. Over in Dany's plotline we have 2 kings, so one of them goes to hunt the white boar and the other king dies with Viserys.
Sure. Yeah. White lion, you said boar, but yes, I know what you're saying. Yeah, that's really interesting. So I like these overlaps and connections. And like you said, they're leading to something. It's making sense other than, oh, that's cool. So my favorite part of this is that they don't know this connection. They don't recognize this overlap and this echoing, and it's gonna be not so good for them in the end. No, I really enjoyed this chapter. It's
I did
not
too.
At all
what I was expecting. Once we got into the market, I remembered the thing with the wine from the show.
Yeah, me too. I was like, oh, this is going too well for her. She's having too good a time. Oh yeah, and Jorah was being kind of cagey and squirrely. I was like, oh yeah, this is where the wine happens.
I think this is the part I was most excited for when we started reading this book, because you remember all of the intro scenes. You remember Tyrion being captured in the tavern, and Jon going to the wall, and Tyrion pissing off you remember all that stuff, and you remember that Ned dies at the end. But this interim period between his arrest and his death, that's probably what I remember the least of.
Yeah, same.
So I'm really excited for the next couple months as we get into this almost uncharted territory.
Right. We're really getting into the last third of this book, so I'm really excited to see everything ramp up.
Speaking of books, we are brought to you today by my latest novel and audio drama, Lemon Tarts in Space. This came out a couple weeks ago. We did a 10-minute announcement video or episode with an explanation of everything about the book. It's a light science fiction dark comedy. We gave you some more context, some influences, some comparisons, and then a 2-minute preview of the fully produced audio drama starring myself and Tristan, our beloved occasional co-host. It is available right now. The paperback is 200 pages, and the audiobook, audio drama, which you can find on Audible and Spotify and everywhere else, is 3.5 hours in 10 sitcom length episodes. Thank you so much. The response really has been incredible for that, but thank you again for checking out the book. Thank you for checking out the Patreon, where you can find piles of bonus episodes, dozens that we've compiled over the years. This is now December when this episode is coming out. We are doing a full Robert Eggers thing leading up to Nosferatu. So over on the Patreon, we're going to have done a bonus episode about his Hansel and Gretel short film, and we're going to do a new installment of our Breakfast Buffet series about other Nosferatu movies. We covered the original silent film a couple years ago, but we've got some other remakes and influences that we want to brush up on before Christmas. What is it? We're seeing it like the day after Christmas.
Yeah, we're devastated because it comes out on Christmas, but nobody else in my family is interested in seeing this movie, and we were like, we can't just abandon them.
No, I would like to be with family on Christmas.
Right. Yeah. Seeing a movie on Christmas is interesting. I know a lot of people do it, but I'd rather just spend time with family. Anyway, so
speaking of Christmas, you know what would make a good Christmas gift?
What?
Lemon Tarts in Space, my brand new novel.
$9.99. Link down below.
All right.
That's a great plug.
That's it from us today. Thank you very much for listening, for the support, for the book and the Patreon, and we'll be back in just a few days with another brand new episode.